I think when we step back and say, this is absurd, we're talking about this. It's absurd. It's engulfed the world. Well, it's because there's something deeper happening. It's in the conflict, the eternal conflict that is happening. So regardless of where you stand politically, where you stand theologically with this, please step back and see the absurdity and ask the question, why? Why throughout history has the world been against Jews? Why? Why have repeatedly nations, kingdoms sought to destroy them? Why?
Our children are leaving the faith in droves.
As a result.
Oh, I got to pause here.
We're going live right now.
How can we raise our kids to stand firm, have a faith that lasts, and navigate such a time as this?
We're here to report that our nation's capital has just been...
To turn a nation, you have to take the next generation.
Today in the news, COVID-19 number.
I'm Jake McCandless, and this is my podcast, Stand Firm Parents. We're working together to help our children have a faith that lasts.
And now, here's Jake McCandless.
Here we go. Another episode of Stand Firm Parents. I'm Jake McCandless. I'm here in LifeWord Studios. Thank you for watching, listening, following Stand Firm Parents, whether you're doing that over on the Stand Firm channels on our platform or on LifeWord. Super excited about how things are going and the great responses I've been getting. So we recently did a 4-part series on our children in Israel. And we really took surface is not the right word, but we faced the topic without going too deep theologically. Because I know across those, you watching and listening, there's many different views. Now, one thing you're going to notice here, we're not going to shy away from the truth, but my heart is to help us as parents, help our children have a faith that lasts. And to make sure that message is getting across, I will choose my battles. But in this episode, we're going to wade in deeper theologically about Israel because you asked for it. Wasn't me. You asked for this. It's your fault. No, keep the questions and comments coming, whether you're commenting there on YouTube, on Facebook, whether you're sending emails, jake@standfirmministries.com, whether you're sending requests through our website, Stand Firm Ministries, or whether on the platforms of LifeWord. Wherever you're viewing, wherever you're listening, watching, hey, get in the conversation. It's about us trying to figure this out together. I love hearing from you as you wrestle through these things. So in that series on Israel, which meant to be just one episode, by the way, now, it's a topic that I definitely knew I wanted to cover down the road. If you've followed Stand Firm Ministries for very long, you know we talk about 6 spiritual prepper steps. As I was pinned down on the question of, okay, if you just boil it down, what's the things we need to do, we need to put into our family to help our families have a faith that lasts? We begin to walk through these 5 W's plus 1 H. And part of that is tell the whole story. Whole with a W, so we can keep that whole W thing going. Because a lot of times what we're doing with the word, we just present a sliver of the word, and we're leaving out a large portion of the story, and some of the elements that I believe that we're leaving out, of course, is the end of the age, which we talk about quite a bit. Israel, God's future plan for Israel, and the relationship between Israel and the church, and the unseen world. So we're going to do episodes on those things. But there's so many different topics I want to talk about. And I know the most divisive thing in the world right now is the question of Israel. It shouldn't be so divisive in the church, but it is. But I wanted to cover it. I was talking to my friends, Andrew Kirk, Daphne Kirk, who were in Israel. I'm like, hey, let's talk about what you're experiencing. Then I feel that nudge from the Holy Spirit. Talk about it more. So I spent an episode explaining it. That nudge, talk about it more, turned into 4 episodes. Now it's turning into 5 plus a special series. But you asked for it. From that series, the questions I have gotten so far is, okay, Jake, how should I believe about Israel? Because the episode where the just me, how this works. You have the episode like today where it's just me. I don't like them as much. So I understand if you don't. I get it. I love being able to sit across the room or the table or across Zoom and have these conversations with these fascinating individuals walking with the Lord and what the Lord's revealed to them. Because I always hear something that I don't expect, I'm being shaped. I'm learning in the process. I'm taking you along for the ride, I don't read books. I just get to call the author up and say, hey, tell me about your book. No, I do read some. But my goal in the episodes where it's just me is to bridge some of these things, because most of our guests, they're not in family ministry. They're not aiming towards parents. That's why I bring them in and taking their discipline, what they've learned, and trying to apply it. Okay, so, but they have that one episode in that series on our children in Israel where I talk about how this issue is so impactful to our children's faith. But in that, I just talk about, hey, Israel's on every page of the Bible. And so regardless of where we stand politically or what we think theologically, our children just have this issue of seeing the news, hearing about Israel everywhere else, at school, especially on a college campus, and then wrestling with that it appears in the text. So it's going to impact their faith. That's all that episode meant. And the feedback I got was, Jake, how should I stand towards Israel? How should I understand God's plan for Israel? How should I understand the relationship between the church and Israel? If I'm to help my children, if this plays a part in them having a faith that lasts, what do I need to say? What do I need to do? So I'm like, okay, I'll do an episode on it. Passionately do an episode on it because the Lord has had my heart burning on this subject. So much that I want to say, I'm really having a struggle to keep this into my time that I've set for myself, which doesn't make much sense. So what I want to do in this episode, I'm going to walk through the two biggest questions that I think exist in us trying to understand how should we view Israel biblically, theologically, and how do we pass this down and help our children navigate through these things. So in this episode, I want to introduce those two questions, and then I have done several episodes, special bonus episodes, on a seminar that I do called The Truth on Israel. And I encourage you to check those episodes out to work through that. And you can find them there in the show notes, wherever that is, down below, up above, to the side, wherever that is. You can find that link, click on it, follow the instructions, and then somehow you're going to get those episodes. They may become available elsewhere, but right now that's how they're available. So I encourage you, dive deeper, check into it. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this subject. I'm sure that came out over the previous episodes that we did. I've always been positive towards Israel. I've always been in churches that were positive towards Israel, but I never really understood that. And then 2014, 2016, I began Stand Firm. I began talking about things of the end of the age, prophecy, those type things. And I remember getting into it, and I began to work with other people. I'm like, everybody who does prophecy, all those prophecy guys, they become Israel guys. They cross the line. Get a shofar, and they have an Israeli flag behind them, and they're going to drop Hebrew words every now and then, which I can't do. If you saw my Hebrew grades, you would understand, but it didn't take long. By 2018, I'm an Israel guy. I didn't get a shofar until last year, and it's actually my daughter's, but hey, we're working on it. But you can't help looking into God's future plans and not wrestle with Israel, and I believe not develop a heart for Israel. I always say at the start of my seminar, Truth on Israel, I always talk about that you didn't just show up to learn some facts about Israel. Rather, God's inviting you into his heart and what he's up to, and I really believe that. That's why I'm not surprised that this is ballooned into at least 5 episodes and a whole series of other special episodes. So in 2018, I began doing this seminar. At that time, it was called Church We Must Get Israel Right. And the first time I did it, I remember sharing at a church. It was a church I had a great relationship with, and it was the worst thing ever. Like, no one gave a flip. I don't know if it was me, them, I don't know. And the next week, I'm presenting at another church. We've got like a 6-hour drive, me and my wife, and we're driving, and I'm telling her, I was like, I don't understand. I don't really understand enough of this myself, but I said, I'm as burdened as sharing the gospel to share this message about Israel. And one of the things we had learned in the process of developing that is if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews died. In that museum, it starts with an exhibit talking about how did this happen? And the scholars who put this together came to the conclusion it happened because of teachings within the church. Now, I'm not saying Hitler was acting out of Christianity, Nazism was Christian, I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is the roots of it was what we were teaching in the church. And so as we're going, I feel so passionate about this, so burdened to share this, but like how do you help an audience? How to help you right now see this as value when it's no telling what kind of text you've got on your phone. No telling what's going on as a parent, all the stuff you're dealing with. In between ball practice, band practice, cheer practice, tutoring, school. Yeah, I guess school's got to be in the mix. Whatever you have, maybe you're homeschooling, whatever it is, how does this become relevant? And the conclusion we had was if the church had been passing down accurate teachings, then it would have made a difference of the Holocaust. And I believe Scripture teaches that there's going to be another type thing like that still to come in the future. And regardless of that, if you saw those previous episodes, if you were there for the episode with Charlotte, she talked about how that anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is at an all-time high in the world. Unprecedented. Growing by the day. As I record this, I know you're going to be watching, hearing this in a few weeks. There's no telling what's going to happen by that time. Okay, so I want to start this party. We're like halfway into the episode. What I mean start. I want to continue this party talking about just the reality and the absurdity of the reality to what's going on. So the reality in our world right now is, as I just said, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred is at an all-time high. Protest around the world on behalf of, now they say pro-Palestine, pro-Palestinian, but ultimately it's pro-Hamas because what happened October 7th was Hamas, the political power, also a terrorist group in Gaza who controlled Gaza, invaded Israel, committed an act of terror, took hostages. There's no telling what you've heard in the media, heard in the news. Some covered accurately, some don't. I had the chance to go just a couple months after it happened and see these places, see the music festival. We're at that festival, 370, mostly young people, were killed, 40 taken hostage. Had the chance to go in one of the kibbutz, one of the neighborhoods, where over 60 had been killed and some taken hostage. I get to walk in the homes, one particular home, young couple, early 20s. It was hard to find a place in that home that didn't have a bullet hole. An act of terror. And this is after decades of Gaza continually shooting rockets into Israel. So you have this happening in Gaza, and then you have Hezbollah in the north who has continued to shoot missiles. You've had Iran be involved, other groups, and all these things. That's the reality. But the absurdity is how the world has sided with Hamas. It should seem absurd just to realize the world is rallying behind terrorists, but that's not close to the amount of absurdity with this. I want to share a graphic. You may have seen this. If you have, you understand the absurdity of this. But if you're able to watch this, check this out. We're trying to make it available in the notes as well if you're having to listen to it and not getting to watch. I want to share this image. Okay, so what you're seeing there in the green is Muslim nations, many of those Arabic nations, and that little red speck, that little red dot is Israel, the only Jewish nation. And so the argument being made is that the Arabs in that little red dot aren't free. And that's far from the truth and the reality, because when you go to Israel, it's not just Jews. You go to a neighborhood, there'll be a Jewish home, an Israeli Arab home, a Druze, a Christian, all living together, participating in the nation together. But in the area of the Gaza Strip, which again was controlled by Hamas, again in the West Bank, are those who've chosen not to live under Israeli rule, leadership, governance. But it's far from there being a lack of opportunity of freedom. For if you take the Arab League, it has 22 member countries, 5 million, over 5 million square miles of land versus just one Jewish state that has less than 1 million, far less than 1 million square miles. So as you hear that chant, from the river to the sea shall be free, talking about the Jordan River, talking about the Mediterranean Sea, this cry of Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, in the West Bank, calling for freedom, where they have the opportunity. Well, long story there, but when there's 22 Arab nations, only one Jewish state. Absolutely absurd, just in that manner. But it gets worse. So, to me, the absurdity is that the Israeli-Gaza conflict is even the main news. Because when we talk about Israel, we're talking about a place the size of New Jersey. No offense, you listen in New Jersey. 290 miles long, 85 miles wide at its widest. Just to record an episode, the studio is 185 miles from my house. We're talking about a very small nation. The square mileage of Israel is 8,600. The square mileage of Gaza, just 141 square miles. Yeah, just 141. So I'm in Arkansas. Arkansas is 52,000 square miles. You can fit 6 Israels in Arkansas. You can fit 368 Gazas in Arkansas. I live in Benton County. Within Benton County, you could fit 6 Gazas. The absurdity that the whole world would be on fire over Israel, over the Gaza-Israel conflict. It's absurd. To me, when you see that graphic I put up there, when you see this reality, one, that people are marching on behalf of a terrorist group in the United States. Back in August, when 6 hostages were found recently murdered. So, I mean, they have been held hostage for nearly a year. As the Israeli army is closing in, Hamas kills these 6 hostages. Israel finds them. The next day, there's thousands marching in New York City on behalf of Hamas. Absurd. And then to talk about such a little place impacting the world, absurd. And I think it's in this absurdity that we have to say, whoa, more's going on here. Something else is going on here. And I think Scripture explains what's going on. Zechariah 12, verse 2 says, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. In other words, the Lord's going to get the world drunk on Israel. I don't think we're exactly at that exact prophetic time, but it's definitely happening, right? I mean, you go back to when the attacks first happened, you have people all over the world marching in protest for Hamas. World is drunk. And then in verse 3, it says, on that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. Psalm 2 talks about the nations raging against Jerusalem. I think when we step back and say, this is absurd, we're talking about this. It's absurd. It's engulfed the world. Well, it's because there's something deeper happening. It's in the conflict, the eternal conflict that is happening. So regardless of where you stand politically, where you stand theologically with this, please step back and see the absurdity and ask the question, why? Why throughout history has the world been against Jews? Why? Why have repeatedly nations, kingdoms sought to destroy them? Why? Revelation 12 talks about, gives this picture of a dragon chasing this woman and the woman giving birth, and it's all this symbolism But it's really talking about Satan pursuing Israel throughout history as it's happened. So I think for all of us, we should step back and just say, whoa, something's going on here. Something doesn't make sense in the world. There's a lot of things that doesn't make sense, but this absolutely doesn't make sense. There must be something deeper, something spiritual behind this. So as I said, 2 questions theologically that deal with Israel. The 2 questions. Number 1, is God done with Israel? To me, that's the debate. Within Christianity, you have those who believe, hey, God is done with Israel. He has turned his attention to the church. We're in the New Testament. You probably can tell I have no conviction saying that. Like it's absurd. But anyway, that's out there. The other question is, okay, how does Israel relate to the church? Those 2 questions are the main questions dividing Christianity in terms of how to understand Israel. And so as you try to help your family navigate these issues, these are the 2 big questions. So the first, is God done with Israel? Again, I will go in more detail of these questions in that special series, again, available in the notes. But I want to share some verses. Luke 21:20. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. This is Jesus when he's asked, what are the signs you're coming? He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you'll know desolation is near. Jesus wasn't saying anything new. Zechariah 14, the prophet Zechariah says, a day of the Lord is coming, Jerusalem, when your possessions will be plundered and divided up within your very walls. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. Zechariah 14:3-4. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in 2. Psalm 83, we see these nations coming against Israel. Ezekiel 38, we see the same description that it talks about the Gog and Magog, but it talks about these nations coming against Israel. Revelation 16 talks about Armageddon, again, happening in Israel. Revelation 19 talks about Jesus' return, again, happening in Israel. Armageddon, the location, is in Israel. And so as we go through all the passages about the end of the age, center stage is Israel, is Jerusalem. So that question, is God done with Israel? He can't be if it's center stage to the events of the end of the age. Then you have Romans 11. Romans 11:25 to me summarizes all we need to know on this subject. And all throughout Romans 11, the Apostle Paul poses the question, is God done with Israel? No, heck no, throughout the passage. We'll come back to that. But if all the events of the end of the age, and there's so many more I could have read, I went through that really fast. I mean, one of the main things, right, involves a temple, involves the Antichrist in the temple. So if all these things are happening at the end of the age, in Israel center stage, God can't be done, right? So biblically, from the text, when it talks about the return of Christ, the end of the age, Israel is front and center, and actually all those passages in the Old Testament, not only talk about, the Lord coming, the Lord fighting for them, and armies coming against them, but it talks about them coming back to the land as that has happened, and talks about them being restored. So if we're going to begin to talk about, well, God is done with them, then what we have to do is then adjust the view of the end of the age, right? So there's very little debate when you come across passages that straightforwardly say these things are going to happen, they're going to happen in Jerusalem. There's not much debate over that. The debate comes when we begin to talk about, okay, what does this, when is the end? Has the end happened? So it comes down to someone's end time views, our views on Bible prophecy. Again, I know listening, watching, it's all across the spectrum when we talk about that. But I just want to walk through what some of these are. So there is a futurist view, which says many of the things talked about, such as the return of Christ, restoration of Israel, those things, that they're happening in the future. We'll come back to that. Another view is the preterist view, which means and talks about that all these things, Bible prophecy, return of Christ, judgment on Israel, all of that took place in the first century, wrapped up in 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. You have the historist view, which talks about these things being fulfilled already in history, but it's kind of open to whoever to place it wherever that is. You have a symbolic view, which says, these things aren't literal. They're just symbolism, spiritualism. Again, you can probably tell I'm not saying that with much conviction. I'm clearly a futurist, but I'm sharing this because depending on who you're hearing, you need to know where they're coming from. So from the scriptures, we can't deny at the end of the age, God is dealing with Israel still. So he's not done. There's still forefront in his plan. But someone can take a view that moves the end of the age or Bible prophecy's fulfillment. Probably, I guess, a more accurate way to say that. So if you're preterist, it's already happened. If you're historist, it's already happened. If you're symbolic, then it's all symbolism. It doesn't matter, And so in those views, you can say, hey, God is done with Israel. He dealt with them in the first century. He dealt with them in whatever year you want to plug in, or it's all symbolism. But if you see these things in the future, you have to say, hey, God's still at work. He's still got a plan. But within the future's view, there are variations. So there is a view called the premillennial view, which means Jesus returns and then establishes this kingdom for 1,000 years. We read that in Revelation 20, and he does this, and that kingdom is ruled out of Jerusalem in Israel. So if you're a futurist, premillennial, again, you see God still got work to do. He's still working in Israel. Then there's a postmillennial, which sees the stuff future, but talks about we're in that millennial kingdom now. And so depending on where you are with that can shape how you view God's continued plan for Israel. And then there's amillennialism, which means there's no literal millennial kingdom. So again, you can still see some stuff in the future, but again, with that, you don't have to say God's still got work to do with Israel. Now, within the future view, there's more variations as well. Those are the main ones. So I want to point that out because when you're wrestling through, is God done with Israel? And you're hearing these different things, whether that's in your own church, whether that's in a Bible study, whether that's something you're watching or listening to, you need to understand where they're coming from because we can't dance around with the text. The text is there. And so then we have to decide, okay, when did this timing happen or is it yet to happen? So that question, is God done with Israel? Well, those are the elements at play with that question. Of course, myself, I'm a futurist, I'm a premillennialist. I believe Israel is front and center of what God's going to do. Now, the second question, how is the church connected with Israel? So within Christianity, there is a division. It's actually the most predominant one is to say Israel doesn't matter so much today because God is focused on the church. Now, positive names may be used like covenant theology. My side of it, I would call that replacement theology, and it's dealt with directly in Romans 11. Actually, Romans 9, 10, and 11. But in Romans 11, the Apostle Paul directly deals with that, and in the process answers both questions. So in Romans 9, we actually see the Apostle Paul talking about the unbelief of Israel. He doesn't hide it. Remember, Paul's a Jew as well. All the disciples were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. But then he follows that up with Romans 11, verse 1. He says, I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. And the way the original language is, it's really emphasized. It's like we would say, heck no now, or something along those lines. Verse 11, in chapter 11, he says, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? No, not at all. Heck no. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So that's verse 1. Verse 11. Verse 29. He says, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Again, coming back to God is not done. Then he explains it all, talking about, gives this analogy that non-Jew believers, followers of Christ, Gentiles, are grafted into the promises of Israel, given to Israel through God. And he summarizes it this way in verse 25. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, that you may be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles have come in. So he's saying, yes, there is unbelief, but that hardening is allowing Gentiles to come in to these promises, to be grafted in. But as the full number of Gentiles come in, or another way we may say it is when the Great Commission is fulfilled, then that hardening will fall away and Israel will be saved. Now, there have been Jews who have come to Christ all along. But Paul explains what's going on in the whole. And did you notice he says, I'm saying this so that you don't become conceited or arrogant. Basically, so that you don't think you replaced them. So that you don't think you're the only people of God. And that's what we've done. So there's two questions. Is God done with Israel? I just shared a few verses about the end of the age. We see Israel's front and center. So the text is there. It's just how you interpret that to happen. Has it happened? Is it going to happen? Again, that's where the question falls. And this question, did the church replace Israel? To me, Romans 11 sums it up. I don't think there's any debate there. Okay, as parents, as we wrestle through this, I know I shared a lot, and I went through it fast. I break it down more in these special episodes, again, in the notes, up above, wherever that's at. But how do we wrestle with this? Again, I think we're all coming from different angles. Theologically, how do you wrestle with this? I think one thing that we've really got to, as parents, make sure that we're doing, as all followers of Christ, as believers, let's make sure we're reading the text. A lot of times when we're dealing with issues of the end times or Israel, we tend to just take what other people said. Maybe you're just taking what I say. Don't do that. Read it for yourself. Don't add to it. Don't take a view and then try to read into that. Just what does it say? And I really believe when you take just a fair, objective reading, there's no way you can walk away and say, God's done. And then just a fair reading through Romans 11, I don't see any way you can walk away from that and say, the church has replaced Israel. Now, there's a lot of layers in that question, but just in general. So when you take that, I think we should see God has a continued plan for Israel. I believe the church has a role in that. And I believe Gentile believers have a role in that. And in God's continued plan, again, the special episodes, we'll talk more about what that is. But he talks about bringing his people back to the land. He talks about what they will go through when they come back. And eventually he talks about the restoration. And God's been working that. And so I think as believers, we need to realize we need to be on God's side, and being on his side is in support of his people. That doesn't mean everything Israel does as a nation is right. Doesn't mean everything his people do is completely right. But I don't know about you, but I want to be on the Lord's side, and so I believe it's being supportive. I believe it's being a Zionist. Ultimately, that we understand the Lord is going to restore his people and restore the nation of Israel. And I think we've got to be careful in conversation, assuming or presenting that God's done with Israel and that the church has replaced it. I know there's a lot of walkthrough. We started and we looked at the absolute absurdity of this, and hopefully it's made you ask the question, what in the world? There must be more going on. And then wrestling with these two questions theologically. And I hope that you lean in, but don't just take my word for it. Get into the Word. You've been listening to Stand Firm Parents. Stand Firm Parents is a production of Stand Firm Ministries in partnership with Life Word Studios, created by Jake McCandless and Brandon Harrington of Dime Collective. Again, thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe, share, and most importantly, stand firm.